Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti. Bello vedere la sala piena, grazie di essere qua. Iniziamo questo evento di presentazione del libro Il Gusto di Cambiare, la transizione ecologica come via per la felicità. Abbiamo qua il piacere di avere i due autori. È un incontro pensato soprattutto per incontrare il coautore di questo libro, Gaël Giraud, professor Giraud, e appunto questo evento lo dedichiamo a lui. Quindi ringrazio innanzitutto avere Gaël qui tra noi. Padre Giraud insomma, ha avuto un percorso personale proprio di conversione, di transizione proprio. Nasce come economista, passa dalla vita da broker finanziario a diventare un prete gesuita. Oggi la sua missione è quella di dedicare la propria vita all'istruzione dei giovani. Insegna alla Georgetown University, dove è anche direttore del programma di giustizia ambientale, è visiting professor alla LUIS di Roma, alla Sorbona di Parigi ed è, oltre che altre molte università nel mondo, in Sudafrica, in Vietnam per esempio. Ha ricoperto durante la sua vita diversi ruoli molto importanti anche al di fuori dell'ambito accademico. Sicuramente voglio ricordare il suo ruolo come capo economista e direttore del programma dell'Agenzia francese per lo sviluppo e insieme a Carlo appunto ha scritto questo libro nato a luglio dell'anno scorso e che tratta proprio le argomentazioni sulla transizione ecologica. Il punto in comune tra le due argomentazioni di Carlo e Gaël sono sicuramente una forte attenzione verso gli argomenti della giustizia sociale e della giustizia ambientale. Mi piace specificare che Gaël è stato il primo a portare in Italia la terminologia transizione ecologica, in quanto nel 2015 è stato pubblicato appunto in Italia un libro dal titolo La transizione ecologica. Quindi chi meglio di lui per affrontare questa tematica? Vi ringrazio nuovamente per essere qua, vi lascio due informazioni. Gaël parlerà in lingua italiana, in lingua inglese, scusate, quindi chi avesse necessità può trovare le cuffie in fondo alla sala. A termine dell'incontro sarà possibile prendere una copia del libro per i nostri studenti, il libro verrà omaggiato, lo trovate all'uscita e professor Giraud sarà qua a disposizione anche per eventuali domande a termine del suo appunto speech. Quindi vi ringrazio, grazie ancora Gaël, lascio la parola al nostro presidente Carlo Petrini e buon ascolto a tutti.
Ma molto brevemente, per ringraziare Gaël di essere qui con noi. La nostra conoscenza è datata da 2 anni, ma l'idea di questo libro è nata esattamente 1 anno e mezzo fa ad Amatrice e quindi un dialogo che si è sviluppato sulle tematiche della transizione ecologica. Io oggi lascerei lo spazio a Gaël perché penso che per tutti noi sia molto importante questo scambio di vedute e anche di riflessioni che Gaël sa sviluppare in maniera egregia rispetto alle connessioni, alla importanza di questa fase storica che si è aperta della transizione ecologica e le connessioni che questa fase storica ha con tutte le tematiche dell'economia e della finanza. Allora, lascio per l'appunto questa discussione a lui e nello stesso tempo lavoriamo, avremo 15 giorni di lavoro assieme nel presentare questo libro. Questo libro che noi omaggiamo a tutti gli studenti che sono qui presenti perché possa essere di stimolo a una riflessione rispetto alle tematiche che andiamo ad affrontare. Tra l'altro stiamo ragionando proprio oggi, abbiamo incominciato questa discussione per una connessione, un rapporto diretto tra la nostra piccola università e la Georgetown University e mi fa piacere considerare la disponibilità che Gaël ha dato per tenere un piccolo corso ogni anno qui a Pollenzo, quindi lo ringrazio di cuore per questa disponibilità. Lascio la parola a Gaël.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Parlerò in inglese, è più facile per me e anche per voi, se ho capito bene. So I will speak in English. I'm French, living in the US, now in Italy. So thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's like a little bit, a small piece of paradise here that I'm discovering, and I'm so happy to be with you. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak about a number of challenges that I understand and on which I'm working at Georgetown University. With my team, we have a research team dedicated to environmental justice. So I'm going to share with you a number of points which I believe are very important today, and where I believe food plays an absolutely key role in order to find solutions. So what you're studying today, I believe, is part of the solution, and that's why I think it's interesting for us to have this dialogue. So yeah, the first part maybe is to say that I think we have to think in a holistic way, that is, food is part of a big system, and if we want to understand the place of food, then we have to understand how it is interconnected to a number of other issues that I'm going to tackle now. So first of all, you know that there is a big injustice, which we call climate injustice, which is the fact that those countries which are most vulnerable to climate change for a variety of reasons are also those who are the poorest and who are less emitting the smallest, emitters of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see here, the countries which are most vulnerable to climate change are essentially in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, while if you look at the next slide, here are the countries which emit most CO2. As you can see, there is a huge divide. In other words, those who are responsible for the climate chaos are not hit first, are less vulnerable, are richer also, and are wealthier, and therefore have more means in order to adapt and adjust to the situation they have created. Now, this is a work that we have done with my team, and I want to share it with you because I think it's very, illuminating. So I'm sure you all made the experience that if you try to run, let's say in the savannah, as I did in Chad a long time ago, I was working there in the south of Chad, it's easier, paradoxically enough, than to run, let's say, in the jungle of Vietnam. Why? In the jungle of Vietnam, the temperature is not that high, let's say 35 degrees Celsius, but the humidity is very high, something like 80% of relative humidity. While in the savanna or in the desert, it's much hotter, but much drier at the same time. And the point is that your body, to cool down, needs to be able to sweat. And if it's too humid, you cannot. And if you cannot, you just die because you cannot cool down. And so here, the red curve is the curve above which the combination of temperature, the x-axis, and humidity, the y-axis, becomes lethal. That is, if you're exposed to this kind of combination more than 6 hours, then you just die. One exception, Luca, he's very sporty, he would resist, but otherwise, normal human beings would not, you see? So for instance, if you have 40 degrees Celsius, as soon as you have something like 20% of humidity, then you just die. You need to rely on air conditioning, for instance, but we know at the same time that air conditioning is definitely not the solution, because air conditioning is polluting, and air conditioning leads to a number of big problems in terms of the stability of the electric system. Maybe you're aware of the fact that in 2019, the US Army, together with NASA, published a report about the problems that might arise in the decade 2020, and that might prevent the US Army from putting into practice its own mission. So this was in 2019. And they said there are two things that might prevent us from doing our job. First, pandemics. This was before COVID-19. And second, power blackouts induced by the overuse of air conditioning, especially in the south of the US. And this is exactly what we see today. That is, in Texas, California, you have huge blackouts because people rely too much on air conditioning. And when they will be exposed to these kind of lethal combinations of heat and humidity, they will, of course, rely more and more on air conditioning, which will make probably a chaos in terms of electric stability of the system. So now we have done this work, which is a map about the situation on the planet at the end of this century, or close to the end of this century, if we keep following the business as usual scenario, just putting into practice what we promised at the Paris Agreement in 2015. As you know, in 2015, there was the famous COP21, where all the United Nations agreed to implement the nationally determined contributions, that is, the contribution of each country to its own decarbonization. And as you know, this is not sufficient in order to respect the 2-degree threshold. So if we do this and just this, we might move towards something like plus 3.5 degrees Celsius of, rise of the average temperature on Earth at the end of this century, plus 3.5. Now, what we have done is to simulate the places on the planet where people will be exposed to little combinations of heat and humidity, and how often they will be exposed to that. And here is the answer. So if it is dark red or brown, it means people will be exposed to little combinations of heat and humidity pretty much every day. If it is light yellow, it means every third day. If it is orange, it means every second day, you see. And so the conclusion is that most of the Amazon basin will be just uninhabitable. Central America will be hell on earth. The Guinea Gulf will become very, very hard, even though we seem to be more optimistic for this region than a number of other climate scientists. But especially India, you see, India at least every second day. This is already happening today. As soon as you have a heat wave in India, you have hundreds of people dying in New Delhi, for instance. Why? Because it's too humid. And then they don't have access to air conditioning, and they just die. And look also at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia will be uninhabitable, with a big geopolitical question, which is, for instance, Indonesia. Indonesia today, it's 180 million people. There will be 200 very soon. It's the most populous Muslim country in the world. So big geopolitical impact. What are these people going to do? We don't know. I have no idea. Are they going to migrate to Australia? I'm not sure that Australia will be very hospitable. Are they going to migrate to, Malaysia, Vietnam, which is just the backyard of China? No idea. And when I speak about these questions with people in Washington, D.C., where I'm working, or at the United Nations in New York, honestly, they have no clue. Nobody has any clue about that. So this is not for tomorrow morning, even though, as you probably know, Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia, is already no longer the capital city of Indonesia because it's drowning because of the rise of the sea level. So Indonesia is already experiencing big troubles because of climate change, and this will just be worse and worse in the coming decades. So as you see, there will be probably millions of people migrating in the second half of this century. They will look for food. There is a big food insecurity issue that I'm going to mention in a few minutes. And so we definitely need to take this seriously into account. Otherwise, all what we're doing now will become irrelevant if we don't address these kind of big questions, I believe. Now look also at the US. The southeastern coast of the US is also hit. So every third day approximately, so which means there will be migrations also inside the US. Same story for China. Look at China, the eastern coast of China with gigantic cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Macau, etc., will also be hit. So also inside these big gigantic countries, there will be climate migrations, okay? And so I believe this is what we want to avoid if we want to be able to eat peacefully at the end of this century, or yourself or your kids. Yeah. So this is just a kind of joke, un piccolo scherzo, grazie. This is a painting that has been made by Alyssa Singer. Alyssa Singer is a painter, an American painter, who is painting the cover page of each report of IPCC. IPCC, it's the International Panel for Climate Change, which is publishing these reports about the science of climate change every 5-6 years. And so Alyssa each time draws a painting for the cover page, and she drew that for us, taking both the map that I just showed you about the impact of combinations of heat and humidity and the map of greenhouse gas emissions. So the big circles that you see, for instance, in the US or in South Africa represent the magnitude of CO2 emissions. And so she drew that. And so we have this in our lab in Washington because we do believe that if we want to do good science, we have to put it into dialogue with arts, because arts touches the heart, if I can say so, and then science helps the brain understand what's going on, okay? So, as you have seen, Italy is not concerned by combinations of heat and humidity, fortunately. Why? Because it's not humid enough, even though I know that each year people in Rome complain that it's too hot and too humid during l'estate, but there is another dimension of the ecological crisis where Italy is hit badly, which is the lack of drinkable water. So I remember that 2 years ago I came to I had an interview at La Rai Uno, at 8 o'clock p.m. High audience, and I said to the journalist, well, in a few years Italy will have big problems with access to drinkable water, and she was looking at me as if I would be a kind of extraterrestrial body who hadn't understood anything from Italy. Now, I guess everybody has understood that water is a problem in Italy and in a number of other countries. So this is a map that has been drawn by WRI, which is a big think tank in Washington, D.C., the World Resources Institute, which provides an estimate of the lack of access to drinkable water by 2040. So this time, it's not the end of this century, it's 2040, just the day after tomorrow. And as you can see, this time Italy is concerned with a possible lack of access to drinkable water between minus 40% and minus 80%. So 2 years ago I said, as a matter of joke, probably in 2040 the Vatican will no longer be in Rome, and then people would just laugh, and say, oh, it's strange, this Jesuit. But nowadays, I guess you understand that, unfortunately, this might be possible. If we don't have enough water, we cannot do many things. And we cannot survive without water. You know this better than I do. So Spain is concerned in the same way as Italy is, Portugal, of course, Tunisia, Morocco, etc., etc. And this is becoming a big concern for a number of countries. The United Nations are trying now to launch an initiative against food insecurity, because you understand that there is, of course you know that, there is a strong link between water and food. If you don't have water, you cannot have food. You need both at the same time. So the United Nations are now trying to launch this initiative. The Bezos Fund, which Jeff Bezos, which has a lot of money, has put a number of billions on the table to launch this initiative. But unfortunately, they don't succeed in getting enough money. And Bezos does not want to be the unique donor of this initiative, because otherwise people would say, well, it's not the United Nations, it's Bezos manipulating the United Nations, and he doesn't want this to happen. So for the time being, they don't launch this initiative. If they succeed in doing this in the coming month, then my lab will be part of it. And I guess you could be part of it, actually. I'm thinking out loud. The University of Gastronomic Sciences could be part of it, because the question is how to bring food to everyone, good food, so that everyone has something to eat, Yeah. So also on the lack of access to drinkable water, you may know that, so Tunisia is facing this problem for years now, and Morocco as well. And so what they do today is desalinization of seawater. So they pump the water from the Mediterranean Sea, they pump it out, they desalinate it, and they use it, let's say, for agriculture. Then the question is, this requires a lot of energy and a lot of money. Money is not a big problem. You can always find money if you want to, and you discuss with a number of other governments, with the World Bank, etc., etc. But energy is an issue. So Morocco, fortunately, has the big solar plant of Ouarzazate. Tunisia doesn't have it. And Tunisia, therefore, has to think about a plan in order to have renewable energies in its country, in order to have enough energy in order to pump out the water for its agriculture. And there you start seeing the link between energy, renewable energy, water, and a number of other issues that I will mention now. So this is what I want to convey. This is my main message. That is, we have to think systematically. If you forget energy, you don't have water, at least in Tunisia. And my guess is that we will face the same problem in Italy in a couple of years. I know that Portugal and Spain are already planning to have big plans in order to extract, to pump out the water from the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not aware of anything analogous to this in Italy. Maybe it's already starting, I don't know. I hope so. I'm sure France is not doing anything, which I think is not a good idea. We should start now having these plans for tomorrow when water will be very, very scarce. So next point. Now, the third, the third point, so water, energy, the third point is biomass. So this map has been drawn by friends of mine, colleagues of mine at NASA, which is just the production of biomass at the world level each year. Of course, you recognize the Amazon forest, the Congo forest, and the tropical forest of Indonesia. Now here, this is the consumption of biomass, which is, of course, the root of any type of food. And so, as you see, the map is completely different. You have a number of regions which do not produce so much biomass by themselves, like the north of India. Maybe we can just go back to the previous slide. So you see the north of India does not produce a lot of biomass because it's just, the beginning of the Himalaya mountains. And now you see they consume a lot. This is the most populous region of India. Also the poorest, where Narendra Modi has more popularity. And this is the place where they consume so much biomass while they don't produce it. Same story for Indonesia. You see the Java island. So Indonesia is consuming a lot of biomass. Same story, of course, for India, the south of Japan, and a few other places. So Europe and the US are not in such a good shape, but not in a catastrophic shape either. So now you can draw the map of the deficit of biomass production, regional biomass production by people. That is, where it is like dark red or black, it means that you have a huge deficit. You consume much more than what you produce locally. In other words, you rely heavily on international value chains of international trades of food. And we have seen during the pandemic COVID-19 that these international value chains are very vulnerable. We have also seen this at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, where Ukraine could not export its grains to the north of Africa, which became a big problem, as you know, for a number of countries, starting with Egypt. And that's why, Egypt is playing such an ambivalent role with Russia and Ukraine in the war. Because Egypt desperately needs the grains from Ukraine. And you know that Ukraine is an El Dorado in terms of agriculture. Ukraine can feed 600 million people, almost half of the Chinese population. And so, to rely so heavily, so much on international trades of food makes you very vulnerable unless you believe that international trades are, eternal, and we know they are not. You see what I mean? And so this means that once we launch this initiative with the United Nations, we will have to address this issue. How do you help people relocalize food production, eat local food, local produces, etc., etc.? And this, not just here in Italy, but everywhere, actually. Look at the map. This is actually, I think, the target map for us to understand how to fight against food insecurity in the coming years and decades. Now, as you know, food production is not the unique problem. We also have pollution. And as you probably know, plastic pollution is one of the most terrifying and dangerous thing we are committing now at the world level. So here you have a map which is well known, where you see the places where people produce plastic wastes, which end up in the ocean. And you know that some people speak about the sixth continent because it's so gigantic, the number of, the quantity of plastic that we are just throwing out in the ocean every year. And so this is another question, and I guess also a question for you. How can we produce food, local food, in a way which is sustainable in the sense that we don't produce so much waste at the same time? You know better than I do that 1/3 of our food production is not consumed. We just throw away, on average, 1/3 of our own food production, which is just insane when you think about it, because there are 800 million people starving, who are hungry every day. But then, on top of that, part of the waste is made of plastic, and this is just destroying life in the ocean. Now, so water, energy, biomass, and the fourth item is minerals. And this is much less understood. The point is that in order to shift from an economy based on fossil fuels, which is not sustainable, towards an economy based on renewable energies, we need much more minerals, especially copper. And it happens that I published a paper with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who is a geophysicist. We have shown that most probably by 2060, at the world level, we are going to reach the peak extraction, the peak copper. That is the point where it will no longer be possible to increase the quantity of copper that we extract from the soil every year. This does not mean that after 2060 there won't be copper anymore. That's not true. There is a lot of copper on the planet. But it means that the density of the reserves of copper where we are extracting the copper we need for our industrial uses, this density is going down very rapidly, is declining very rapidly, which makes it more and more difficult to extract that copper every year. And to extract copper, we need energy and water. We need water to separate copper from the rest of the other minerals which are in the soil, you see. And there you'll see the link between the various items I was mentioning. In order to have minerals, you need water and energy. In order to have renewable energy, you need new minerals. You need more minerals. A society based on renewable energy is more mineral intensive than a society based on fossil fuel energies. In order to have energy, you need minerals, because if you want to have solar plants, for instance, you need to have a number of rare earths, etc. And in order to have food, you need water, obviously, and energy. You see? So there is a link between, there is a nexus, actually, between food and between, let's say, biomass, water, energy, and minerals, and I think that's what we need to address, including when we speak about food. A country in the coming decades which will have access to the 4 items will be safe. A country for which one of these four items will be missing will be in trouble, because once one of the 4 items is missing, you get into trouble in order to get access to the 3 others. You see. And yeah, this is a part of my paper. So if you look at the left bottom, this is the curve of extraction of zinc, copper, and aluminium, starting at the beginning of the 20th century. So as you see, like for everything, certain things begin after the Second World War, the industrial consumption, and after that you see the curve is exponentially growing. And when you show this to any type of geophysicist, he or she will tell you that's just not sustainable. To give you just one figure, very simple, the density of the reserves of copper, where we extract the copper today, rame in Italiano, the density 30 years ago was 5%. So in order to get 1 ton of copper, you had to dig 20 tons of soil. Today, it's 1%. So in order to get 1 ton of copper, you need to dig 100 tons of soil, which means much more, at least 5 times more water and energy. And actually, it's not linear, it's also exponential. The cost is also exponential, so which means much more energy and water. Make sense? Okay? So, so as I said, so a renewable-based economy is more mineral intensive. Recycling is key. I don't know any plan for any type of ecological transition without recycling. So I was yesterday in Torino at the Cermix, which is a beautiful place. I don't know whether you know that, which has been founded a couple of decades ago by, what's his name already? Ernesto Olivero, see? And they do recycling, essentially. And I think that's the future. So there is one country on the planet which is recycling in a very systematic way, it's China. And I think they're right. That's what we should do. We should recycle much more. There are upper bounds in recycling. We know that we cannot recycle more than 80% of any type of substance. This is the kind of thermodynamical upper bound. But today we are very far away from this upper bound. I mean, at most, for certain products, we recycle like 30%. So we still have a big margin of improvement in order to recycle much more. Now, the good news is that we can do it, provided we stop miniaturizing everything. So this, for instance, is too difficult to recycle because it's too small. So it requires a lot of energy and a lot of water to recycle. But big computers are easier to recycle. We can recycle them. So we should try actually not to have these kind of beautiful gadgets, even though it makes our lives so fancy, and have simple objects, simple manufactured objects, which are easy to repair and easy to recycle. So in the same way we speak about slow food, I think we could speak about slow economy. A slow economy where we don't just throw this out every 3 years, in order to buy the new generation of gadgets, but we keep it because it's a recyclable object that has been manufactured for the long term, you see. And so recycling is absolutely key, but it's not enough. Why? There is a law in mathematics which is very easy to understand, which is that if you have an exponential declining converging to zero, it converges very quickly. In other words, if you recycle, let's say, 50% of a substance, then the year after you will recycle 50% of 50%. 3 years later, 50% of 50% of 50%. And you can just think about it, it goes very quickly to zero. So recycling is just a way to win time in order to find substitutes. So we need to find substitutes to copper. We need to find a new concept for the industry with less material impact, less minerals, less water, less energy, things that we can easily repair, etc., etc. And for that purpose, recycling is just giving us more time because it's not easy to do. Make sense? Yeah. Also, there is on the issue of matter, minerals, and all this, there is a big north-south divide. I don't have time to go into all the details. You will have access to the slides anyway. I just want you to remind that there is a big divide between the south and the north. Essentially, the south so far has essentially produced raw materials for the north. You know this, but it's good to say it again. And so there is a big question today, essentially for Africa. Is Africa going to be the next plant, the next big industry for the planet? You know that China is no longer producing for us, as it did during 20 years. After 2009, Beijing decided that they were done with producing for Western countries, getting a lot of money, reinvesting that money into financial markets, which was essentially the cycle, the virtuous cycle, at least for us, during 20 years, starting in the early 90s up to the end of, let's say, 2010. Since then, China is reorienting its production towards its domestic market. And today, the commerce, the international trade between China and the West is essentially balanced. While earlier, a couple of years ago, China had a huge surplus. It's no longer the case today. So essentially, the value of what China exports is equal to the value of what China imports. And then the big question for the future is, who is going to produce? Where is the big next industry going to be? A number of people believe that this will be in Africa, because Africa is the unique continent which is going to have a big demographic push in the coming decades. But this is a big question. How do you do that? China is not investing into industrial infrastructures in Africa. It's just, grabbing material resources. What is the West doing? Big question. Do we want to help Africa develop? So, these are big geopolitical questions. And if we speak about food, I think we have to take this into account. Yeah. So, sorry, there is also the big, social divide linked to the increase of inequalities. So this is very famous. It's The Elephant by Branko Milanovic. Branko Milanovic is a very famous economist from the World Bank. And so the x-axis is just the distribution of income in the society. So if you are on the right end of the x-axis, this means that you belong to the top 1%. If you are on the left end, this means that you belong to the bottom 1%. Okay, and in the middle, in the center, it's the middle class. And now the y-axis is the fraction of growth that you have accrued in the last 40 years. And as you see, if you believe in the elephant, then this means that essentially the top 1% has made a lot of money, a lot of income, but the middle class also was not completely crushed because of the head of the elephant. Now it happens that a number of other economists, yeah, please. The other one, yeah, stop here. A number of other economists have redone the computations with different data and have ended up with this, the Loch Ness Monster, which is completely different. It's a completely different story because now only the top 1% has made money in the past 4 years, you see. So this is just a funny way to say we also have to address this inequality issue. If we want to make the big change that we have to put into practice, which is to shift from an economy based on wastes of everything and fossil fuel energies towards an economy which is sober, with a low material footprint, scarce water, and good at the same time, because food must be good, then we definitely need to address this inequality issue, I believe, because otherwise the social acceptance of the change will be very hard. So as a summary of the challenge that we are facing, I believe, for me as an economist at least, we can look at this map that we have used at the French Development Bank when I was serving as the chief economist over there. So the x-axis, here it's the HDI, Human Development Index. The HDI is a kind of alternative to GDP, which is based on 3 pillars: average income per capita, the average level of education, and average level of health in the society. So it's already much better than GDP, because GDP is just focusing on income. Now you have education and health. I completely agree that this is not sufficient. We should add inequality, we should have ecological footprint, etc., but at least, you know, the United Nations are publishing this HDI index every year, and it's a way to go a little bit further than just looking at the GDP. So if your HDI is above 0.8, which is here, which was the HDI of Russia a couple of years ago before the war, then people think that you are more or less okay, you know. It means that you are in a society which is desirable, at least as desirable as the Russian society could be a couple of years ago, could have been a couple of years ago. Now the y-axis is the ecological footprint. You know, it's a measure of the impact of our activity on land, which has been conceived by a Swiss engineer in California, Matthias Wackernagel. And if it is above, if your ecological footprint is above the carrying capacity of the planet, it means that if everybody had your living standards, we would need more than one planet, which we don't have. So it's just not sustainable. And so here, you have the carrying capacity of the planet in 1961. And here, you have the carrying capacity of the planet in 2012. And as you see, it's going down. Why? Because we are destroying ecosystems, forests, etc., etc. Probably today it's even lower. And so the big question is, can we organize a society in such a way that we end up in the magic square, which is here, where we have a sustainable ecological footprint, we are below the carrying capacity of the planet, we need less than one planet to live, and above 0.8 HDI, that is, we have a decent society. And as you can see, this square is empty. So each point is a country. So most poor countries, if you can say so, are on the left, bottom left, which means they have a very low ecological footprint, that's good, but they also have a very low HDI. So for them, the main challenge is to go to the right without increasing the ecological footprint, to increase the HDI without increasing the ecological footprint. And most rich countries, including Italy, are on the top right. That is, they have a high HDI, good for them, but they also have a very high ecological footprint, which is just not sustainable. And so our challenge in Italy, in the West, is to go down vertically without decreasing HDI. So everybody has to do something. Nobody has the solution. We all have to find our path towards a fair, sustainable solution. And I think food plays a key role, as you know, in finding the right path for that purpose. Now, it happens that a couple of years ago, there was one country which was exactly at the edge of the square. Here. So can you guess which country it was? Does anyone know? New Zealand? No. Morocco? No. A good idea, but no, not yet. It was Cuba. Cuba. And so when you say Cuba, of course you think, well, it's not very, you know, do I really want to organize my society in such a way that I look like Cuba? And the answer obviously is no. Why? Because of human rights and democracy. And so what is missing here is a third dimension, human rights and democracy. So we all have to achieve the magic square as a target, and at the same time to keep human rights and democracy. And this is becoming key everywhere, including in the US. When you see what happened on the 6th of January, you can wonder, you know, and maybe in a number of European countries, you know. And so I believe this is one way to understand the main challenge of the planet, which is both an economic challenge, social challenge, and political challenge. Make sense? Yes? So now I spent just 5 minutes describing what we do at Georgetown University so that you have a flavor of what we do. We are working with indigenous people in the Amazon, the Sarayaku indigenous people who speak Quechua. So I'm about to try to learn Quechua in the coming month, hopefully. And the leader of these people is Patricia Walinga, who is an indigenous woman. She is now the spokeswoman of these indigenous people at the United Nations, a fantastic woman. And so we are working with them in order to provide them with data about the impact of climate change on the Amazon and also the impact of deforestation and mining, so that when their population talks with governments of the Amazon or with big mining companies, they can, they can talk with data, with models, etc. So we are weaponizing them, but not with weapons, but with science. The next point is Kenya. We are working hand in hand with GRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is a big NGO working with refugee camps. And it happens that they have a lot of, they have a lot of refugees in the north of Kenya. And what they told us is that today, when someone is entering a refugee camp, on average, that someone spends something like 17 years in the camp. That is, the camp is no longer, a kind of transitory place where you end up and a few months later you go home. No, you enter the camp, you get your kids in the camp, and you die in the camp. That's the reality today. So the main challenge for GRS is to find a way to help refugees escape from the camp, paradoxically enough, and settle down in the country, even though they might not come from Kenya. And so they asked us to help them have a mapping of aquifer resources, water, beneath the surface, so that they can sedentarize as organic farmers with the plan for decentralized photovoltaic, so that they can, have electric pumps and try to survive this way. So the next point is, the next project is South Africa. We have an agreement with the South African government. South Africa is facing big challenges. So the first one is that obviously the South African economy is entirely, or was entirely, based on coal mines, as you know. Now they have to shift towards renewable energies, and that's a big challenge. Second, 65% of the black youth in South Africa is jobless. 65%. So that's an incredible challenge, social, political, economic challenge for them. They have to find green jobs for the youth. Third, the main utility provider, whose name is Eskom, which is a state-owned company, which provides electricity for the entire country, is essentially bankrupt with a huge public debt, and nobody knows how to pay back this debt. So what they asked us is to think systematically, holistically, a model, a macroeconomic model, hybrid model, with both the macroeconomy and finance, climate change, natural resources, so that they can figure out how to deal with these three challenges at the same time. Now, Mongolia, so for instance, so for the time being, it's not moving forward because the Mongolian government is very complex, at least for me. But Mongolia asked us also to think about a network of organic farms for nomadic people, because the nomads in Mongolia are starving because the cattle are dying because of global warming. So this is what they call dzud. A dzud is a situation due to climate change where they have very hot and dry summer, very cold and dry winters. And the consequence is that the cattle just die, and therefore nomadic people cannot survive. And so what's happening today is that they sedentarize in the slums around Ulaanbaatar, and this must be horrible. So the government wants to offer them an alternative. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. Same thing for Ukraine. So we haven't started, but you may know that there are a number of reconstruction plans for Ukraine. So what we have decided to do with some colleagues from Loyola Universidad in Andalusia is to build a model so that we can compare the pros and cons of each green reconstruction plan for Ukraine. Yeah, maybe we can move on. Yeah. There is also a big thing, I believe, that is hardly discussed in the public arena, but I think which is very important, which is that, you will be surprised, I'm sure, that we have to save our banks. I say it again, we have to save our banks. Why? Because most of our banks, especially in Europe, in the US, have a lot of fossil fuel-related financial assets. So I have published a report 2 years ago with a think tank of mine, of which I'm the president, that I created just before the pandemic, which is called Institut Rousseau in French, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher. And we have shown that if you scrutinize the first 11 banks in the Eurozone, they happen to have 530 billion euros of fossil fuel-related financial assets. So at first glance, you would say, 500 billions, well, it's not, it's a huge amount of money, but it's not that big, no? In comparison, let's say, to the GDP of the Eurozone. But the problem is that if you look at each bank separately, these fossil fuel-related financial assets represent, on average, 95% of the equity of each bank. And as you know, if a bank loses 95% of its equity, that bank is just bankrupt. Which means that if tomorrow morning we decide to be bold in terms of the ecological transition, and we decide that both coal, oil, and gas are stranded assets, that nobody can burn them anymore, then these banks will be bankrupt. They know it perfectly. They didn't wait for me to understand that. They understood it before I would realize that. But nobody knows how to solve the problem. And the bankers are not directly to be blamed. Why? Because what they have on the balance sheet is just the mirror of choices that have been made by our society, by us, in the past. In the past 50, 60, 70 years, we lived essentially thanks to oil, coal, and gas. And so our banks had to invest a lot in oil, coal, and gas. So that's normal. And now we inherit the consequences of the past in the balance sheet of our banks. Now, if we want our banks to finance the green transition, we need them to be willing to do so. For them to be willing to do so, they must not think that the ecological transition will imply their own death or the death of their own business model, you see. So we need to find a way to extract the fossil fuel assets from the balance sheets of the banks so that they can be free to finance the ecological transition. And this is certainly true for Intesa Sanpaolo in Italy and a number of other big banks in Europe. You get that point? And so if we want to, let's say, just to address the food security problem, we need, paradoxically enough, to think about the balance sheet of our banks. Because if we don't solve the problem of the balance sheet of our banks, they won't finance, or they will do it very reluctantly, finance the big projects that we need to put into practice in order to save the world population from food insecurity. Okay? So why are we so blind? 5 minutes about anthropology, and which is a point that we discussed a lot with Carlo in the book. Go ahead. Yeah. So first of all, it's very strange, but everything I said so far has been more or less already anticipated by a guy from Luxembourg who was the director of the World Bank for Europe a couple of years ago. He published a book which is called High Noon. I highly recommend the reading of this book. I give this book to my students in Georgetown every year, and I ask them to read it. And when you read it, you think, wow, the guy has understood everything. But the funny thing is that he published this in 2002, 21 years ago. Nobody cared about that. Nobody spoke about this book. But this means that it's possible to anticipate what's happening. It's not just a black swan which is coming, from a completely unexpected place. All this can be anticipated. I think the way this university is very prophetic in terms of promoting gastronomic sciences is also a sign that we can be ahead of the wave, You are ahead of the wave in terms of gastronomic sciences. We need to be ahead of the wave in terms of facing the big ecological challenges that we have to face. And this is possible because there are people who are clever enough to see in advance what's going on. Yeah. Also, I want just to get rid of, the very easy thought which says, well, the situation is serious, but humanity always succeeded in finding an escape route. That's just not true. So it happens that there is an American historian whose name is Mike Davis, not Miles Davis, the trumpet player, but Mike Davis. He published a book about what happened in the late 19th century. So you had back then a big El Nino effect. I'm sure you know what an El Nino effect is. A trouble in the circulation of water in the Pacific Ocean, which has big impact on Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But back then, around the 1890s, the colonial administrations of Brazil, most sub-Saharan African countries, India, and some Chinese places did not pay attention at all to this. And according to Mike Davis, the outcome was something like 50 million dead. So he claims that this is the reason why so many southern countries were backward at the beginning of the 20th century and had already lost the competition game, because an entire generation has been killed by a big El Nino effect. And so so this shows first that unfortunately big tragedies already happened, because this is as big as the First World War. And second, we are even able to forget it, because I'm sure you have never heard of this up to today. And when I discovered that, I thought, well, this is not written in any textbook, in any, high school. How come? Well, probably because we feel a little bit guilty, and we don't want to talk about that, you see. So just to say, tragedies might happen. Our job is to make sure that they don't happen again, okay? So is there a country which succeeded in the past in avoiding an ecological catastrophe? And the answer is yes. And this country is Japan. And that's very interesting, I believe. In the 17th century, the shogun, the shogun is the general of the Japanese army, at the beginning of the Tokugawa era, realized that they were cutting trees more rapidly than the pace at which trees grow. And on an archipelago like Japan, completely isolated from the rest of the world, which could not import woods, if you cut trees too rapidly, then after 1 or 2 generations, you no longer have a forest. If you have no forest, you have no wood. If you have no wood, you just die. So they were clever enough to understand this. And then they tried to plan and to organize the stationarity of the society, of the Japanese society. So they did it a la Japanese, if I can say so. That is, they decided that each couple could have only 2 kids and could cut a fixed number of trees, and each guy who was caught cutting more trees was tortured a la Japanese. Something not funny. So I'm not saying this is the ideal solution, of course not. I'm just saying there was at least one country in the world which understood a long time ago that we have to respect the rhythm of nature, of Mother Nature, if we just want to be able to survive. And I'm sure this is also what you do with food, that is, we have to grow food in a way which respects the internal rhythm of nature, otherwise we are just destroying the resources which keep us alive. So, in other words, the big challenge, you remember, is to go towards the magic square that I was alluding to earlier in my big map, and to do this not in the way Japan did it in the 17th and 18th century, but in a more human-friendly way, if it's possible. Now, just a side remark on this, linking science, history, and arts. We are all fascinated, I guess, by the Japanese aesthetic, you see that, the beautiful bird, which is very light, very simple, very sober. And this is one of the key features of the Japanese imaginary. If you see the tea ceremony lasts something like 2 hours for 3 cups of tea. So it's even worse, if I can say so, than Italian coffee, There is a kind of, Italian coffee is something absolutely fundamental and key, and that's beautiful. And me as a French, I worship Italian coffee. But Japanese worship tea even more than we do, They spend 2 hours for 3 cups of tea. But if you think of a society which has to reduce tremendously its material impact and still have fun, how do you do that? You organize a tea ceremony, you see? And so I think one of the reasons why the Japanese aesthetics is so fascinating to us is that we feel unconsciously that they have succeeded in doing something extraordinarily, that is to organize the beauty of a sober society. And maybe that this is also what we have to think about. So now a few words about something that we discussed with Carlo in the book, which is the common goods. It happens that there is a very famous political scientist whose name is Elinor Ostrom. She was working near Chicago. Unfortunately, she died in 2012 from cancer after having received the Nobel Award in Economics in 2009. And she contributed essentially to the study of what we call the commons. The main idea is the following. Most of us economists, we think in terms of 2 types of goods, private goods and public goods. And actually, we inherit this from the Roman law, res privata in Latin, res publica in Latin. So private goods is essentially a good which is dedicated to the market, public good which is dealt with or managed by the state. And so what Elinor said is that, no, there are two other types of good. There are tribal goods or club goods like this one. This is a club good in the sense that if I'm alone to have un telefonino, then it's useless because I cannot call anybody and nobody can call me. If we are 8 billions connected to this, then it's very useful, you see? So that's a club good. And she spoke also about common goods. Common goods are goods whose consumption is rival in the sense that if I consume it before you, I might destroy the resource and you might not have access to it, but the access cannot be regulated in the way a private good can be regulated. Very simple example, think of fisheries. As the chief economist of the French European Bank, I visited a number of projects of fisheries in Zérekore, which is in the dark forest of Guinea-Conakry, just after the Ebola crisis. So over there, farmers have to survive in the forest. So they cannot have cattle. You cannot have cattle in a forest. And they are also at the same time too far away from the ocean in order to be able to fish in the ocean. So they have a lack of proteins every day. And so the solution for them is to have ponds and to have fisheries. But it's a country where people don't have access to electricity. They have no power. So when you decide to take away the fish from the water, it's a big decision because you have to eat it the very same day. You cannot keep it in your fridge. There is no fridge over there. And so they have developed a number of rules, very sophisticated, in order to take care of the ponds and the fishes as common goods. So they share the responsibility, they share the management, and they survive this way. There are a number of other examples. I can give you the example of La Paz in Bolivia. You know, La Paz is the capital city of Bolivia, 4,000 meters high in the mountains. Earlier it was in the jungle. Today it's in the desert because of global warming. So all the glaciers have melted, have disappeared. And in 2016, it happens that the center of La Paz had to experience what we call the day zero. So the day zero is the day where there is no water on tap. And I know that a number of villages in Italy have experienced this traumatic experience last year, and some French villages are about to make the same traumatic experience this year. Because once you don't have water on tap, you are completely dependent of people selling you water at whatever price, from outside. And then, it's a very dangerous situation for your own survival. So La Paz was struggling with the day zero, but at the same time, poor people in the suburb of La Paz had water. How? They had organized themselves in small communities of women. They had given the power to women, not to men. And the women were managing water resources as a commons. So they were saying, well, if this family wants to have access to the water, you have to contribute to the common good of the community. You have to do this, this, and that. And it worked perfectly. So they had water, while rich people in the center of the city were struggling, trying to buy bottles of water, with plastic and all this, which is crazy. And then there are a number of other examples I could mention. We can discuss this. So I'm convinced that commoning, putting a number of resources in common, is definitely part of the solution. And maybe when you think in terms of food, you can also think in these terms: how can we organize the production of food in such a way that part of it at least becomes a commons? Because if you think about it, everything we do relies on commons. Even the language is a commons. I did not invent Italian or English or French. You did not either. Nobody did. And we share it in common, nevertheless. We can change it. The way we speak changes the language every year. But at the same time, we are not the owners of the language, of culture. We could think also in terms of health as a global commons. And maybe you know that Stefano Rodota in Italy wanted to write into the Italian constitution the fact that water, aqua, should be a common good, bene comune, no? So he did not succeed, unfortunately. But there is a European country which did it. This country is Slovenia. So Slovenia has written into its own constitution the fact that water cannot be privatized and must be a common good. You see? And I think this is also the future, I believe. That is, we have to put boundaries to the privatization of the world. We don't have to, private ownership is a good thing. It just needs boundaries. Public ownership is also a good thing, but also needs boundaries. For instance, if you think of the Amazon and the fact that Bolsonaro refused to take care of the Amazon and to kill the wildfires which are destroying the forest, but at the same time, there is nothing in the international law that forces a sovereign country like Brazil to take care of a global common good like the Amazon, which, as you know, is the main lung the main sink of absorption of CO2 in the planet. And so this means that the absolute sovereignty of the public sector, like a state like Brazil, must have boundaries. We must be able to say, no, there are global commons that you have to take care of because you are not the owner of it. It's a global common for the entire planet. Maybe you followed the negotiations at the international level inside the United Nations about the bottom of the oceans. So just a couple of months ago, we finally, after 20 years of negotiations, succeeded in getting something like the beginning of treaties and international treaties about the bottom of the oceans. One big victory is that we said they cannot be privatized. Unfortunately, we did not succeed in saying there are common goods because there is a big controversy among international lawyers about what it is to be a common good at the international level. But this is already a very interesting step forward because then we could say this country is not allowed just to destroy the bottom of the ocean just because there is a crazy guy who has been elected, even if he has been elected democratically, you see. And one last slide, and we stop here, it's this one. Beautiful drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, no? L'uomo di Vitruvio, or l'uomo vitruviano, si dice. So I think, and this is what we discuss with Carlo in the book, I think beneath the surface, below all what I said so far, we need to recycle, we need to invent a new type of manufacture, we need to take care of international trades for the food, we need to do all what I said, to organize common goods, etc., etc. Beneath all this, behind all this, there is an anthropological challenge, which is that we have to get rid of the imaginary of humanity, which is embodied by destroying. So I'm not saying that Leonardo da Vinci thought that this is a symbol of humanity, but many of us believe that this is a symbol of humanity. Let's be honest. I'm sure the first time you saw this in high school, you thought, well, that's humanity. No? And when you think twice about it, you say, well, there is just half of humanity because there are no women over there. It's a male. No? So where are the women? Second, obviously, it's an European, West European male. So where are all the other people from the planet? Obviously, it's an adult. So no kids, no elderly people. Obviously, he's in good shape. He's good health. So handicapped people, sick people are not there. And nature is completely absent. So he's alone in a complete solitude, metaphysical solitude, facing the world, as a master, equipped with what? Geometry, which means science and technology. And so, to a certain extent, Europe, which was definitely not part of this kind of imaginary during the Middle Age and the 16th century, think of the beautiful 16th century in Italy, has nothing to do with this. But the 17th century converted towards this, with the beginning of, the first sciences, Newton, Bacon, etc., Descartes in France. And we started slowly moving into this direction. And I believe this is part of the problem today, that is, we unconsciously believe that this is us. And that nature is just, a blind, mute vis-a-vis that we can just destroy and exploit because it's not us, But when you think about it, actually, we are part of nature. You know that better than I do. And so we have to get rid of that in order to re-enter into a relational anthropology, and I would even say cosmology, where we realize that what matters is the relationship. Our relationship to nature, our relationship to our neighbors, to our friends. In Africa, we would say our relationships to the ancestors. So in Africa, in a number of countries, this is called ukama. In Zimbabwe, for instance, in the language Shona, ukama means I am because we are. And we are because there are relationships between myself, my neighbors, my family, the members of my tribe, let's say, but also my ancestors in the past, and also the future kids, which are not yet born. But I have a responsibility to them, you see? That's ukama. And we could mention Buen Vivir in Latin America, same idea, essentially, We could mention Swaraj in Hindi, in India, same idea, roughly speaking. So many people are perfectly aware of the fact that what matters is relationship. And we Westerners, for 3 centuries, we entered into this crazy idea that we could just be the masters of the planet in the same way we interpret Leonardo da Vinci's drawing. And I think that's what we have to get rid of. And I'm absolutely convinced that the place where we have to start is the food. because that's so vital to us and anthropologically so basic and elementary that if we convert our imaginary and our anthropological imaginary with food, then we will be able to convert everything. Thank you.
Abbiamo tempo per qualche domanda, in English or in Italian? Ok.
Do you think it's more difficult talking about the graph with human development index and carbon footprint? Is it more difficult to bring in the bottom right corner a country in the upper right corner or in the bottom right?
So I don't know whether everybody understood the question. The question is it more easy if you go back to this? So the question is it easier to go from here to here or from here to here? And the answer is I don't know. I mean, it's a case-by-case question, you know. I think for a country like Tunisia, it's more or less easy to go to this square. For a country like Chad, it's much more difficult. So there are, you know that Wagner troops are already in the south of Chad, so Russia is already trying to invade Chad, which is becoming a big concern because Russia is already in Central African Republic, Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali. So now to bring democracy in Chad will be a big challenge, you see. So it's a case-by-case answer. There is no one-size-fits-all answer for that. Un'altra questione o domanda? Si può anche in spagnolo, tedesco, se vuoi.
Volevo chiedere, prima lei ha parlato di riciclo dei materiali che utilizziamo e anche dei minerali, dell'estrazione dei minerali. Per quanto riguarda oggi, ad esempio, la mobilità, come ci muoviamo, la creazione di batterie al litio abbiamo visto che comunque consuma moltissime terre rare, piuttosto che materiali sostituenti la plastica, spesso sono in mano a multinazionali che deforestano la foresta amazzonica. Quali possono essere, secondo lei, possibili materiali innovativi piuttosto che metodi di mobilità più ecologici?
Sì, grazie, è una questione enorme. Allora, come lo sapete? C'è l'idea che la macchina elettrica sarebbe la soluzione. Non è la soluzione, non è una soluzione sostenibile. Potrebbe essere una soluzione. So in italiano, sorry, I have to speak in English, I'm sorry. So as you know, many people believe that electric cars are the solution. In terms of green mobility, it's not the case. I don't believe it's the case for the reasons you just mentioned. That is, the main question is battery. How do you keep the electricity for the machine, for the car? And so the batteries, as we build them today, need a lot of cobalt, lithium, etc., which makes them non-sustainable in the long run. So my viewpoint is that we need two things. First, to develop a lot of public transports, much more. So I don't know any plan of any ecological transition for any country which does not rely on the train. I did it for the French government a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, and every scenario was relying on a big development and unfolding of the train network. And so we need the same for Italy, we need the same for Spain, Germany, etc., etc. So in Europe, it's relatively easy to do. In a country like the US, it's just a nightmare because the US doesn't have the infrastructure that we have in Europe, and the US faces a big problem, which is the absolutization of private ownership. So even if the federal state wants to have a railway, which goes in this direction, but which crosses the land of someone, and if that someone is powerful, it's very difficult. Then it's a big, big mess, legal mess, So first of all, train, and second, hydrogen. So hydrogen is or will be a very good way to store electricity. The unique problem is to produce green hydrogen. But once we know how to do this, and we will know how to do this in the coming years, then we should be able to have cars with hydrogen as a way to store electricity. And then this is much better. At the same time, I must admit, and we all have to admit, there is no such thing as a completely clean solution. It does not exist. we will have a material impact in 50 years, no matter what. The question is how to reduce it and to keep it below boundaries which are compatible with just the sustainability of the planet, you know. So we cannot dream of a way to become angels. We are not angels. We will never be angels, fortunately. We have a body, and that's a good thing, I believe. You know, Christianity is based on the idea that the body is a good thing, and which means we have material impact, but the question is how to keep it within boundaries. Make sense?
Io volevo sapere cosa pensa lei della relazione tra le scelte personali, le scelte politiche e quello che la scienza sa, perché l'impressione è che la scienza abbia chiaro il problema, almeno nella sua complessità. Poi ci sono le scelte personali che sono quelle che dovrebbero influenzare il mercato e diciamo gli attori collettivi, le imprese che producono, le banche che investono, e poi ci sono i decisori politici che dovrebbero indirizzare come dire, le grandi scelte strategiche dell'umanità. Cioè, come si fa a tenere insieme queste cose e quali strumenti abbiamo? Perché è proprio difficile capire che cosa uno può fare a livello personale, che cosa può fare a livello di influenza politica e in questo che ruolo ha la scienza. Insomma, non so se è chiara la domanda, grazie.
Sì, una domanda molto importante. So again, I don't have any very crystal clear solution to that. So the main, I understand the main challenge has been in our democracies today, you have, let's say, the people, the civil society, which in Italy, for instance, is very vivid, very strong, much more so than in France, for instance, or in the US. You have the state and you have the private sector, and within the private sector, you have the financial sector, which has its own let's say, challenge. My feeling is that in many European countries, people are aware of the need to change. And they have in Gusto di Cambiare. My impression is not that we are not the problem. Last year I gave a number of conferences when I was before or after having spent time with Carlo in La Lombardia, and I was amazed by how much people know and are willing to change. And so also I have the same experience today with many CEOs of many companies, industrial companies. I wouldn't have said this like 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they were very far from the energy shift or the need to shift energy, the energy system. Today, they all have understood that this is the business of tomorrow. My experience is that the main problem are the banks, because they know that if we go too fast in the direction of the ecological transition, they will die. And so they think they need time. And I keep telling them we don't have time. So here there is a big problem. So 2 or 3 years ago, or even more than that, 10 years ago, I proposed that the European Central Bank could buy the fossil fuel assets from the balance sheet of banks. Why did I say that? Because most probably the solutions that will show up sooner or later is to reproduce exactly what we did after the subprime crisis in 2009. 2009, big banks had exactly the same problem as we have today, but with subprime assets, which were toxic assets, whose value was essentially zero, creating black holes in the balance sheet of banks. So what we did back then is that we created what we call bad banks, spazzatura banca, no? And bad bank is a state-owned bank which purchases the toxic assets from the private bank, and so the private bank gets money, good, it's Christmas, but for the bad bank will keep the asset and will make the loss. And so it's very good for the private sector. The question is that then the debt of the bad bank becomes a public debt, which means at the end of the day, we are paying, the taxpayers are paying the cost of the whole casino, no? And so I think this is not a good solution. At least it's not a fair solution. And there is a much better solution, which is to ask to the European Central Bank to play the role of the bad bank. The European Central Bank purchases the fossil fuel assets from the private banks, diciamo Intesa San Paolo, and the European Central Bank makes the loss. The big difference is that this is not a public debt of anyone. This is just a loss of the European Central Bank. Then the question is, could the European Central Bank go bankrupt? The answer is no. The European Central Bank is a central bank. A central bank can never go bankrupt, technically. So when I said this like 3 years ago again, during the pandemic, because we had time to reflect and to discuss on Twitter, etc. Some of my colleagues in France said, well, Giraud is completely pazzo, non ha capito niente della banca centrale, etc., etc. Then, fortunately, the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks at the world level, which is located in a beautiful small city which is called Basilea in Italiano, nella Svizzera, in Switzerland, published a report saying, yes, a central bank can make billions of losses. This doesn't matter. Central bank is a central bank. It creates money for free, out of nowhere, ex nihilo, as we would say in Latin, no? And so then the discussion with my beloved colleagues became, well, it's technically feasible. Okay, you're right, they said to me, but we don't want to do it politically. And then the question is why? And then I said, well, I'm sure we will do something close to that sooner or later, because it's very hard to find any alternative which is fair and which does not just ask once again to the taxpayers to pay. And it happens that just 1 month ago, there is a French billionaire whose name is Mathieu Pigasse, probably not known in Italy, but one of the big French billionaires, who gave an interview saying, well, we should think of this solution, So some clever people are starting slowly to understand that we need these kind of heterodox solutions in order to save our ass, if I can say so, and in order to be able to ask the banks to finance the green transition. Yeah.
Salve, volevo sapere, prima parlava degli investimenti delle banche più importanti, che sono per il 95% di ogni singola banca in petrolio e risorse non sostenibili, diciamo.
95% del capitale.
Del capitale.
Non del balance, ok?
Ok. E diceva come questo fosse specchio delle scelte della società e di conseguenza anche un po' delle scelte personali. Per convincere, per portare a far sì che le banche portino più investimenti in asset più sostenibili e rinnovabili, quanto è importante alla fine, viene prima la scelta della banca o la scelta del singolo e di conseguenza della società nel portare la banca a investire in energie rinnovabili?
Thank you for the question. This is a chicken and egg question, and we need both at the same time. If the banks understand that their customers are going to leave them because they're not green enough, they will green themselves. So there is a very simple way for us as customers of banks to vote. Con I piedi is to put your money in another deposit account, And so, for instance, I know that maybe you know this very small bank from Netherlands whose name is Triodos. Beautiful small bank, very young, with a salary gap from 1 to 5 inside the bank. Nowadays in most banks it's 1 to 1,000. So in Triodos it's 1 to 5. The equity is 20% of the balance sheet. In most banks today it's 3%, so they are much more virtuous, and they fund only ecological projects. Now they wanted to be able to open deposit accounts in France, because France is a much bigger market than Netherlands. And then French banks said, no, you're not allowed to do that. And so they lobbied against Triodos with the French government, so that the French government would not give the green light for that. And so Triodos did not succeed. So the French banks know perfectly that if there is one day a very good, virtuous bank somewhere, people will take their money and put it in this bank, and they will have trouble. So they don't want this to happen. So, so this is a part of our power, is to bargain with the banks, saying, well, if I'm happy with you because you're not green enough, or you're not ethical enough, you're not virtuous enough, then I will put my money elsewhere. But you need to find an alternative for that, And on the other hand, essentially the banks know perfectly what I'm saying. They're not discovering this. And they're willing to change. It's not as if they would be non sono cattivi, Not as if they would be stupid or mind or, whatever. But it's a problem of the business model and the fact that they inherit our own decisions from the past. And so we need to save them. That is, we need to take our part in the story and to find a way to free them from the inheritance of these fossil fuel assets. Therefore, the solution that I'm promoting.
Allora, innanzitutto grazie per questa bellissima presentazione. Io ho una domanda molto veloce. Volevo sapere se nel libro o in altri lavori si affronta la questione della crescita esponenziale della popolazione globale e dell'impatto che questo ha avuto sulle risorse naturali, diciamo, a livello globale? Grazie.
Thank you. It's a big question, and we discussed this question actually with Carlo in the book. So maybe I will let also Carlo answer to this question. My answer is very short and simple. In any case, in the next 30 years, there will be a unique continent which is going to have a demographic push, and that's Africa. So Africa today has 1.3 billion people, and we'll have at least 2.3 billion people in 2050, maybe 2.8, no, we don't know. And that's almost for sure, because demography has a lot of inertia, so you know. But everywhere else, in Europe, in Asia, in America, the population will decline. Already in China, the population is stagnating today because of the one-child policy. And a society where the population declines is in big trouble. You know this in Italy. There are sociologists who say, how can the new generation accept the authority of the old generation in a society where there are more old people than young people, where the scarcity is the youth, okay, which has a huge power because it's scarce, no? And where the youth knows that when they will get older, there will be less and less youth people, young people. So they claim that, you know, there is a kind of intergenerational alliance in every society which is growing, where the young obey to the elderly, because they know that when they will be older, the next generation will obey to them. But now, if you have an age pyramid like this, and if you know that when you will get older, there will be less and less young people than you won't have power on them. So why would you, in the first place, obey to the old generation today? And I'm sure you make this experience, that today the intergenerational alliance between, let's say, my generation and the young generation is becoming a problem, where I meet a lot of students who say, why the hell should I listen to you while your generation has messed up everything in the planet and you want to teach me how to survive in this planet, you see? So I see this kind of debate today, and so an aging population in a society is something very complicated to deal with. So at the same time, I cannot promote this kind of model. And we need also young people to be able to work. Who is going to pay the pensions for the elderly if we don't have young people, you know? And so that's why what's happening in Africa today is absolutely key for the future of the planet. So that's why I said earlier that many people believe that maybe we should invest in Africa so that we will have the next plants in Africa, you know. On top of that, two more things. It's very hard to change a demographic trend. That is the reason why Chinese women had less and less kids might not be related at all to the one-child policy. Why? Because Thailand and South Korea had exactly the same demographic trajectory as China with no one-child policy. And so you have a number of demographers who say the reason why China was so, quote-unquote, successful in curbing its demographic trajectory was because at the same time they succeeded in getting 800 million people out of poverty, which was also the case for Thailand and South Korea. And so if you understand that, you say, well, maybe some people want to curb the demographic trend in Africa. Okay, fair enough. How do you do that? You have no idea. They have to solve the poverty problem in Africa, which nobody has solved for, 1 century. You see what I mean? And when I worked as a chief economist of the French Development Bank, I would have a lot of discussions with governments from Africa. They would all say, we are perfectly aware of the demographic challenge, but how do we do that? To give you a counterexample, India in the 50s tried also to reduce the growth of its population. And the Indian government decided to sterilize 8 million people. It's as if today you would sterilize the entire population of Switzerland. I can tell you Swiss people would not be happy. And nevertheless, despite this violence, because it's an incredible violence inflicted to everybody, they did not succeed. So on the one hand, you cannot just decide women are going to have less kids. Kids are the insurance company for poor people. So how do you tell them, no, you are poor and you're getting poorer and poorer, but don't have more kids, And third, a society which is aging is a problem in itself. So we need to have kids, actually. And fourth, and probably Carlo wants to say that, the planet can perfectly feed 12 billion people. It's not a problem. It's a distribution problem. It's not a production problem. Carlo, you want to say something? No?
Yeah, you mentioned plastics pollution, plastic pollution. You know, to my understanding, and going back to the 1960s, that's when it really first started to become a use issue, where we started to use plastics very widespread. Before that, we used glass, we used waxed papers, we used all. Why is it so hard to reverse that trend and eliminate most of the kind of common, not necessary plastics use?
Well, why is it so hard? Because it's so easy to have so many things in plastic. That's essentially a product of oil. And you can make so many things with plastic, from a toothbrush into a bag, into everything. And so that's the reason. We are so accustomed since one generation to have more or less everything in plastic that, to get rid of that requires a lot of efforts. But we can do it. And as you saw in the map, the good news is actually that we are not the main polluters in plastic, but poor countries, because they rely so much on our own plastic wastes that they recycle and they use. And so that's the place where we have to put a lot of effort in order to get rid of plastic. Latin America, Southeast Asia, as you saw, the Guinea Gulf, Ivory Coast, Senegal, etc., etc. That's the places where they produce more plastic waste. That's the place where we can work. And here in Italy, it's more or less easy. It should be more or less easy. We have educated people. We prefer wood and paper to plastic.
But it never seems to quite get done.
Well,
Which is kind of interesting. It never seemed to be a real priority.
I'm optimistic. I'm very optimistic. I can give you one example of something which worked. So the generation of my parents, they would never take a shower. They would take a bath once or two times per week, and the rest of the week they would do the cat toilets. You say that in English, Today, our generation and the young generation never takes a bath, but takes a shower pretty much every day. A shower is much healthier and uses much less water than a bath. And so we have done these big changes because it relies to my intimacy, it relies on my intimacy. We have made these big changes within one generation without having, at least in France, the General de Gaulle saying, French people, you have to take a shower instead of taking a bath. Nobody told this, So there is a kind of wisdom, popular wisdom, and conscious collective wisdom, which taught us to say, well, the bath is not the solution, we have to move towards shower. And we have done it within one generation. So this makes me very, very optimistic. Same story for smoking, cigarettes. I remember in the 80s, when people started saying that we should prohibit cigarettes, everybody was saying, don't think about it, it's just impossible, Nowadays we have done it. So I agree that it took too much time. We don't have so much time in terms of climate change, but we can do it. I'm very optimistic.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Volevo chiedere, Stiglitz, premio Nobel dell'economia, dice che bisogna salvare il capitalismo dal mercato. Volevo chiedere se ha un senso sostenibile e se eventualmente cosa vuol dire. Grazie.
Well, you need to ask this to Joe. Joe is a good friend of mine, but so to a certain extent, so the way I understand what he says is that one of the big problems we are facing today is the deregulation of financial markets. So, for instance, the price of food at the international level is no longer the equilibrium price between supply and demand of food, but is entirely driven by speculation on financial assets on food. That's true for pretty much every type of quote-unquote commodity. And so there is a big question which is how do you prevent a few number of traders in the city, in Wall Street, and in Frankfurt, in Germany, to just speculate on food and to drive prices in a way which is completely crazy and has no relationship with the reality of people eating every day. For that purpose, there is one very simple reform, which is that the World Trade Organization, WTO, which is based in Switzerland, Geneva, is responsible for international trades, but does not have the financial sphere under its jurisdiction. And so when I talked a couple of years ago with the president of the WTO, I said, why don't you impose regulation on the international trades for food? And he said, well, because this relies on the financial sphere, and I have no authority on the financial sphere, which is a big joke today. Of course, after the Second World War, when we created WTO, we said, well, take care of the commodities. Because back then, there was no such thing as a big unregulated financial markets, which was driving the price of everything. Nowadays, it's the case. So we should change the rules of the WTO and add the financial sphere within the perimeter of jurisdiction of WTO, and then implement rules in order to prevent speculation from being the main driver of the price of food. You see? So that's a simple way to say we have to save capitalism from the markets. Unregulated markets are just making a casino in the world. So that's the way I would understand what Joe is saying.
The last one.
Hi, I'm from Brazil. Very quickly.
Bom dia.
Hi, bom dia. How do you see the role of indigenous people with their amazing knowledge of the forest, of the planet,
Exactly.
to help us?
Yeah.
Because I see that sometimes them and all these countries that are now suffering with climate change, I don't see many of them part of the discussions, of the conversations, sometimes in class, sometimes in forums. Where are they? Where are the researchers? Where are the professors from these countries that are suffering, or from countries that indigenous people still exist? Because, in my country, they tried to get rid of them. So how do you see their contribution? Are we gonna give them voice and opportunity to say, hey, I know better because I understand I'm nature? What do you think?
So first of all, I definitely agree with you that indigenous populations have an incredible amount of wisdom and knowledge that we don't have or that we have lost, and that we should find a way to share this with them and to give them a voice. That's essentially what Pope Francis is saying with his, apostolic exhortation, Querida Amazonia. He wrote essentially that. We have to listen to the indigenous populations. So how do we do this? So I don't have any, one-size-fits-all solution, but what I can tell you is that right now, there is an initiative to build un programa universitario panamazónico with the universities of Ecuador, Perú, Bolivia, Brasil e Venezuela no, perché è troppo, no, è demasiado difícil. Sorry, in English. So we are building this network essentially with Jesuit universities, and one of them in Quito, Ecuador. The University of Quito has una estación de investigación in the forest with the indigenous people, essentially with the Sarayacus that I mentioned earlier, whose leader is Patricia Walinga. So I'm supposed to go there in July to spend like 2 weeks with the indigenous populations to see how we could have a partnership between Georgetown University and il PUAM, Programa Universitario Panamazónico, so that maybe I could take a PhD student from the indigenous population who would come like 3 months in Washington, go back to Ecuador, etc., etc. And this way, we are going to try to promote this program, university program, with the indigenous populations, where it would be an exchange. We know a number of things they don't know, and they know a number of things we don't know. So let's discuss, enter into a kind of dialogue. So this might look like a very small, tiny initiative, but that's what I can say. That's my small contribution.
Va bene, io direi che possiamo chiudere questo nostro incontro. Ringraziamo moltissimo Gaël. E vorrei che fosse chiaro un elemento che è venuto fuori dal dibattito e anche dalla introduzione entusiasmante di Gaël Giraud. Ragazzi, stiamo iniziando una nuova fase storica all'interno della quale c'è una moltitudine di problemi da affrontare e questa realtà mi interessa personalmente e interessa questa università, perché se è vero come è vero che noi oggi studiamo un sistema alimentare per come si è evoluto questo sistema negli ultimi 70-80 anni. E badate bene che negli ultimi 70-80 anni l'umanità ha avuto una implementazione demografica come mai si era realizzata nella storia dell'umanità. 70 anni fa la popolazione della Terra era di 2 miliardi e 300 milioni di persone. Oggi abbiamo superato gli 8 miliardi. Se voi pensate che per 1000 anni, dall'anno 0 all'anno 1000, l'umanità è passata da 160 a 230 milioni di persone, vedete come l'implementazione degli ultimi 70 anni è stata di natura esponenziale. E da un lato noi dobbiamo considerare che per certi aspetti la rivoluzione verde, l'implementazione dell'uso della chimica ha garantito una maggior produzione, ma poi in questa fase noi cominciamo a capire e a pagare il dazio di certe scelte al punto tale che questo sistema alimentare non è più sostenibile. Io vorrei che questa riflessione a Pollenzo diventasse forte e per tutta la nostra comunità, dagli insegnanti, agli studenti, a tutti, agli ex allievi. Perché? Perché la fase che va per iniziare sarà una fase dove molti comportamenti dovranno cambiare profondamente. E c'è una riflessione che nel libro dichiariamo esplicitamente. Il sistema alimentare così com'è il principale responsabile di questo sconquasso ambientale. Allora, le carte in mano chi le ha nel prossimo futuro? Non c'è dubbio che ce l'hanno le nuove generazioni, e le nuove generazioni di gastronomi saranno nel cuore del problema, perché se la nostra università deve coltivare un'ambizione è proprio questa, fare in modo che i futuri gastronomi che escono da Pollenzo siano dei soggetti attivi per il cambiamento. E da questo punto di vista c'è bisogno di tutta la vostra creatività, di tutte le vostre riflessioni e di tutte le sinergie possibili tra l'Ateneo e gli studenti, tra l'Ateneo e gli ex allievi, tra l'Ateneo e la società civile. Per cui io ringrazio Gaël per questa sua presenza qui oggi, per gli stimoli che ci hai saputo dare, e nello stesso tempo rinnovo l'esigenza che su questo fronte la nostra collaborazione possa continuare. Grazie a tutti voi, e per gli studenti c'è questo, studenti presenti, sia chiaro, presenti, c'è questo omaggio del libro che spero possa ulteriormente esservi di aiuto per capire questa fase storica. Grazie a tutti.